What kind of truth survives when evidence disappears, but memory refuses to let go? In small towns and open fields, along rivers, roads, and forgotten industrial edges, people have always reported moments that do not fit neatly into the world they thought they knew. A figure at the tree line, eyes caught in headlights, a shape crossing a wall, a roof, a patch of road where no ordinary creature should have been. The details change with the century, the language changes, but the feeling does not. It is the feeling that something looked back. This story begins in places that seem ordinary at first glance. A rural province in France, a farmhouse in Kentucky, a dark road in Massachusetts, a riverbank in Ohio, a fading mining town in Iowa, and in West Virginia, a cluster of abandoned bunkers and empty land known as the TNT area, where fog gathered between the concrete ruins and the night seemed to hold its breath. In such places, people did not claim to witness abstract mysteries. They described bodies, motion, sound, posture, fear. They spoke as if the impossible had arrived not in dreams, but in front of them. Of course, history offers its own explanations. Misidentification, suggestion, rumor. The old human habit of turning uncertainty into story. And yet that answer, while often reasonable, does not dissolve the deeper question. Why do certain encounters linger? Why do some descriptions repeat across distance and time with such strange precision? Why do communities remember not just what they saw, but how it changed the air around them? Perhaps these accounts reveal hidden creatures. Perhaps they reveal the hidden architecture of belief itself. Either way, they lead us to the same threshold, the narrow border where perception, fear, and wonder meet. And once we stand there, another question emerges. When the world shows us something we cannot explain, are we really seeing a monster? Or are we glimpsing the limits of our own understanding? What if a place could teach people how to be afraid before anything even appeared? In November of 1966, two young couples drove into the outskirts of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, toward a lonely stretch of abandoned wartime land known as the TNT area. The name itself carried residue from another era. Concrete bunkers, overgrown roads, rusting fences, and pools of black water hidden among weeds. It was the kind of landscape that seemed to remember too much. Even in daylight, it felt unfinished. At night, it became something else entirely. Their headlights moved across the ruins and then across a figure. Tall, dark, wrong in a way that was hard to explain quickly. They would later say it was not simply standing there, but waiting there, as if it had been part of the darkness until the light found it. Then the eyes caught the beam, two red points, fixed and unnervingly still. When it opened, what looked like wings and rose into the air, the boundary between animal and apparition began to dissolve. What followed gave the story its strange durability. The witnesses did not describe a brief, uncertain glimpse. They described pursuit. A shape keeping pace with their car as they accelerated away, a presence that seemed less like a creature in flight than a force refusing to be left behind. In the weeks that followed, others came forward, drivers, workers, ordinary residents. Their accounts differed at the edges, as human memory always does. But the center held a large winged figure, red eyes, the feeling of being watched by something that did not belong to the familiar world. Skeptics offered reasonable possibilities. A large bird, fear sharpened by rumor, misperception born in a haunted-looking place. Yet fear alone does not explain why certain stories settle so deeply into a town's identity. Sometimes a sighting becomes more than a sighting, it becomes a mirror. And the question Point Pleasant left behind was not only what people saw, but why they felt almost instantly that it had seen them first. How does a mystery change once the cameras arrive? By the late 1960s, the story in Point Pleasant was no longer confined to frightened conversations at gas stations and kitchen tables. It had entered newspapers, radio broadcasts, and the restless circuitry of national curiosity. Reporters came looking for a sensation, but what they found was more complicated. Not a single event, neatly preserved, but a community trying to describe what had happened to its sense of reality. The more the story spread, the less it belonged to the witnesses alone. There is a subtle transformation that occurs when private fear becomes public narrative. An encounter that once lived in the body, in a pounding heart, a trembling voice, a sleepless night, begins to harden into symbols. The winged figure becomes a name. The red eyes become an emblem. And soon a living moment is pulled into the machinery of interpretation. Was it an unknown animal, a collective misreading, a visitation, an omen? Each retelling added shape, but also distance. This is where media enters the story not simply as observer, but as co-author. Cameras do not only record, they select. Headlines do not only inform, they arrange meaning. In the hands of the public, the unexplained often becomes a canvas for whatever a culture most fears or longs to understand. That is why stories like this survive. They are not just about creatures in the dark. They are about uncertainty itself, given a body people can point to. And yet, behind the headlines, the witnesses remain stubbornly human. They did not speak in the language of myth. They spoke in the language of interruption. An ordinary evening broken open, a familiar road made strange. The humiliation of saying aloud what you know others may doubt. Their burden was not only to remember, but to keep remembering, while the world around them turned their memory into folklore. That may be the quiet paradox at the center of every famous encounter. The more widely it is shared, the harder it becomes to recover the first fragile moment of seeing. What survives is rarely pure fact or pure fiction. It is something in between, a human attempt to hold on to meaning after certainty has already fled. What do we call a creature that enters a story before anyone agrees it can exist? Long before modern roads cut across forests and fields, people were already naming the unknown with the language available to them. In medieval France, a beast was said to move through the countryside, leaving behind terror, torn bodies, and the uneasy conviction that nature itself had shifted out of balance. In the 18th century, the so-called Beast of Gévaudan became more than a predator. It became a riddle carried from village to village, described in fragments, unusually large, unnervingly bold, difficult to kill, somehow more deliberate than an ordinary animal should have been. The reports came from a world different from our own, yet emotionally familiar. Rural communities lived close to danger then. Wolves were real, hunger was real, distance, weather, and darkness shaped every life. And still, witnesses insisted this was something apart. Hunters pursued it. Officials documented it. Priests and nobles entered the account. The creature existed not only in fear, but in paperwork, rumor, and public argument. Even centuries ago, mystery drew institutions into its orbit. Looking back, historians and naturalists have proposed many explanations. A wolf or several wolves. A large dog. A hyena escaped from private menageries. A case made stranger by panic, poor records, and the tendency of trauma to enlarge whatever wounds us. All of these remain possible. But possibility does not erase the cultural force of the story. The beast mattered because it emerged where explanation had begun to fray. It forced people to confront how quickly the familiar world can become unreadable. That same pattern would repeat across centuries. A strange animal appears. Witnesses struggle for language. Authorities step in. The public divides between belief and dismissal. Yet beneath the debate lies something older than evidence. The fear that human beings do not fully know the landscapes they inhabit or themselves. Maybe that is why these stories persist. The creature, whatever it was, lives on not because it was solved, but because it opened a wound in certainty. And once certainty is wounded, even history begins to feel like a forest at dusk. What happens when the unknown steps not into legend, but into the bright, practical world of a family farm? In the summer of 1955, near Hopkinsville, Kentucky, an ordinary evening began to tilt toward the inexplicable. The Sutton family and their guests were gathered in a farmhouse, carrying on with the modest routines that shape rural nights. Then came a report from outside, a bright object crossing the sky, strange and silent enough to unsettle anyone who saw it. At first, it was the kind of detail people might laugh away, but the laughter did not last. Soon they noticed figures near the house, small, pale, almost metallic in the wash of porch light and moonlight. They were described with large eyes, pointed ears, thin limbs, and a gliding, unnatural way of moving. The family did what frightened people have always done when the boundary between home and threat collapses. They tried to defend the threshold. Gunfire erupted. Doors opened and slammed. Shadows shifted around windows and roof lines, yet the figures, according to those inside, did not behave as wounded intruders should. They seemed to recoil, disappear, and return. By dawn, the farmhouse had become a stage for one of the most debated encounters in American folklore. Law enforcement found evidence of panic, spent shells, and shaken witnesses, but no clear answer. Skeptics pointed to exhaustion, alcohol, owls, overreaction, the transforming power of fear. These explanations are not trivial. Under stress, the mind can turn ambiguity into menace with astonishing speed. And still, the case lingers because it was not built from one person's isolated claim. It unfolded as a shared experience, witnessed by several people who remained remarkably consistent about the emotional reality of the night. The Hopkinsville story endures not because it proves visitors from elsewhere, but because it reveals how fragile the architecture of the everyday can be. A porch light, a screen door, a familiar yard, these are symbols of safety until they suddenly are not. Then the world rearranges itself around a single terrible question. If home is where we feel most certain of what belongs, what does it mean when the unfamiliar appears right at the edge of the light? What if the strangest encounters are the ones that leave almost nothing behind? In 1978, on a quiet night in Dover, Massachusetts, a teenage boy driving along a dark road saw something that seemed to belong neither to the woods nor to any known field guide. It was perched near a broken stone wall, small and pale against the darkness, with an oversized head and a body so thin it looked almost unfinished. Its eyes reflected the light in a way he could not forget. The image was brief, but not vague. He would later sketch it, not as a theatrical monster, but as something eerily fragile, as though it had wandered into the world by mistake. Within hours, others reported seeing a similar figure nearby. Their accounts were independent, separated by time and place, yet bound by strange agreement. A creature no taller than a child, with long limbs, peach-colored or hairless skin, and a face that seemed less aggressive than profoundly out of place. It became known as the Dover Demon, though the name, like all such names, made it sound more certain than it really was. A label can create the illusion of understanding. It tells us where to file the mystery, even when the mystery itself resists being filed. Unlike older legends that grew over months or years, this one unfolded in a narrow window and then seemed to stop. No bodies, no tracks that resolved the question, no enduring physical evidence strong enough to quiet the debate. Skeptics proposed a young moose, a misidentified animal, a trick of light on a stressed adolescent mind. Believers pointed to the consistency of the descriptions and the fact that multiple witnesses saw something unusual in the same small community. As so often happens, certainty never arrived. The case remained suspended between explanation and atmosphere. Perhaps that is why it continues to fascinate. Some mysteries survive not because they expand into epic folklore, but because they remain small, precise, and unfinished. A wall by the roadside, a glimpse under headlights, a drawing made before memory had time to soften. These fragments do not resolve into knowledge. They remain as they were first encountered, a disturbance in the ordinary. And maybe that is enough to trouble us. Not every unknown thing announces itself with noise or disaster. Sometimes it appears quietly, then vanishes, leaving behind only the unsettling idea that reality may contain forms we have no language prepared to meet. What do repeated sightings become when they gather not around one witness, but around a landscape itself? In the late 20th century, the banks of the Ohio River and the wooded edges of southern Ohio began collecting stories the way fog collects over water, slowly, quietly, until the shape of the place seemed altered by them. People spoke of large, upright creatures moving through marshland and industrial corridors, of pale forms glimpsed near roads, of winged silhouettes crossing low over fields at dusk. None of these accounts formed a single clean narrative. They overlapped instead, creating a geography of unease in which the land itself seemed to invite interpretation. This is often how regional mysteries evolve. One report might be dismissed, two become coincidence. But when sightings recur across years, and when they emerge from people who do not seem to know one another or to gain much by speaking, the pattern acquires emotional weight. In Ohio, as in West Virginia before it, witnesses described not only what they thought they saw, but the atmosphere surrounding the encounter. The unnatural stillness, the sudden pressure of dread, the sense that the familiar had briefly opened to something older and less nameable. Of course, a pattern can be made from many kinds of material. It can grow from misidentifications repeated until they feel consistent. It can be shaped by local lore, by media attention, by the irresistible human desire to connect isolated moments into a design. But that does not make the pattern meaningless. On the contrary, it may reveal something essential about how communities live with uncertainty. When stories accumulate around a place, they begin to act like memory. They alter how roads are driven, how tree lines are watched, how silence is interpreted after dark. In that sense, the mystery is never just about a creature. It is also about what a region learns to expect from its own shadows. A river town, an abandoned structure, a patch of wetland, these become more than settings. They become participants in the story, preserving unease long after the original witnesses have gone home. And so the question widens. Are these repeated encounters evidence of something external moving through the world? Or are they evidence that places themselves can hold and transmit human fear until each new witness steps into a script written long before they arrived? What changes when a town decides to stop asking whether a story is true and starts asking why it refuses to die? In the early years of the 20th century, a small community in Iowa found itself drawn into a strange sequence of nights that would outlast everyone who first witnessed them. It was a mining town, practical and weathered, the kind of place where people understood labor, hardship, and the discipline of facts. Yet for several evenings, residents reported a figure moving above rooftops and along the margins of lamplight, a large winged creature with a horn or glowing appendage, described as both physical and unreal, as if assembled from pieces of known animals and something else no one could quite place. The reports came with the old signature of such encounters: urgency, contradiction, embarrassment, fascination. Men armed themselves and went looking. Neighbors stood outside after dark and searched the sky. Newspapers, sensing the irresistible pull of the unusual, carried the story outward. And once print gave the creature a public life, the town had to contend with two experiences at once: the original mystery and the spectacle that followed it. The second can sometimes become larger than the first. This is one of the quiet roles media has always played in stories of the unexplained. It does not merely preserve an event. It enlarges its silhouette. A local fear becomes a regional curiosity, then a cultural artifact. The creature seen over a handful of rooftops becomes something people far away can imagine for themselves. In that process, the facts may blur, but the emotional truth can sharpen. What remains is not a zoological specimen, but a portrait of a community encountering the limits of certainty. For the people who lived through those nights, the question may never have been whether the world contained legends. It was whether an ordinary town could suddenly become the setting for one. That possibility can be strangely destabilizing. It suggests that mystery does not belong only to remote mountains or ancient forests. It can descend over porches, alleyways, and church spires. It can arrive where people least expect to find it, and perhaps that is why such stories endure. They remind us that disbelief is not the opposite of wonder. Often the two live side by side. A person may doubt what they heard, mistrust what was printed, question what others claimed to see, and still feel in some deeper register that a boundary was crossed. Once that feeling enters a town, it rarely leaves unchanged. So the real inheritance of these encounters may not be the creature at all. It may be the lingering awareness that every community, no matter how rational, carries one patch of darkness where explanation falters and imagination quietly takes over. What if the most unsettling part of an encounter is not what was seen, but what it seemed to predict? As the reports in Point Pleasant multiplied, the winged figure with burning eyes began to drift beyond the category of animal sighting and into something more unsettling. People did not only speak of what appeared near roads and abandoned bunkers. They began to connect the sightings to a wider atmosphere of unease: strange lights, unsettling dreams, unexplained phone calls, a sense that the town had become porous to forces it could neither measure nor name. Whether these details belong to the original event or grew around it later is difficult to say. That uncertainty is part of the story itself. Then came tragedy. In December of 1967, the Silver Bridge collapsed over the Ohio River, during rush hour traffic, killing dozens of people and leaving a wound that would remain in the region for generations. In the aftermath, many could not help but draw a line between the earlier sightings and the disaster. The creature was reimagined by some not as a being in the ordinary sense, but as a herald, a warning, a symbol of dread arriving before grief had found its form. Others rejected that interpretation as an understandable but dangerous pattern imposed on trauma after the fact. This is one of the oldest instincts in human history. When catastrophe strikes, we search backward for signs that the world had tried to tell us. We revisit small disturbances and invest them with meaning. A dream becomes a message, a rumor becomes a clue. A figure seen at twilight becomes an omen. It is not foolishness alone that drives this impulse, it is sorrow. To imagine a warning is, in some hidden way, to imagine that chaos might still obey a design. But the tension remains. Did the sightings gain their prophetic aura because people needed a language large enough to hold the loss? Or do certain mysteries feel unforgettable precisely because they arrive just before history breaks open? The question cannot be settled cleanly, yet it points towards something enduring in human experience. We do not live by facts alone. We live by patterns, by symbols, by the stories that help us bear what facts cannot soften. And so the figure in the dark changed once again. It was no longer merely something glimpsed beside the road. It became a vessel for communal grief, for dread without an object, for the painful hope that even disaster might have left a shadow before it came. In that sense, the mystery of Point Pleasant was never only about whether a creature existed. It was also about how a town, faced with sudden loss, tried to make memory itself survivable. Perhaps that is the deeper lesson of these encounters. The unknown does not always terrify us because it is alien. Sometimes it terrifies us because it attaches itself to the moments we most wish had made sense, and then remains there, watching from the edge of history. What if the unknown did not crawl out of the forest at all, but seemed to descend from the sky? On a September evening in 1952, in the small town of Flatwoods, West Virginia, a bright object was seen crossing the darkening sky. Boys playing outside watched it arc downward beyond a nearby hill. And in the way communities often respond to the unusual, adults joined the search. They expected wreckage, a fallen plane perhaps, a meteorite cooling in the weeds. Instead, they walked into a clearing and found themselves facing something that would remain suspended between folklore and testimony for decades. First came the light, a pulsing red glow in the distance, as if the hill itself were breathing. Then a flashlight beam reached farther into the darkness and found a form, tall, still, and difficult to compare to anything ordinary. Witnesses described a body that seemed metallic or dark green, and above it a strangely shaped head, dramatic and angular, almost ceremonial in outline. The eyes reflected the light with a brightness that unsettled everyone present. Some said the figure glided rather than stepped. Others remembered a hissing sound or an odor in the air that felt sharp and unnatural, like metal left too long in rain. They did not stay. Fear moved faster than curiosity. Later that night, several of those who had approached the hill reported nausea, throat irritation, and burning eyes. By morning, reporters had arrived, and an artist's sketch gave the event a permanent silhouette. Towering, hooded, alien, poised between creature and machine. Once an image enters the public imagination, it no longer belongs only to the people who first saw it. It becomes a symbol, shaped as much by retelling as by memory. Skeptics offered explanations that remained plausible. A meteor overhead, an owl caught in the beam of a flashlight, mist, vegetation, adrenaline, and the strange chemistry of shared fear. Yet the story of Flatwoods lingers because it is more than a claim about a creature. It is a portrait of a moment when expectation failed. A group walked toward what they assumed would be debris from the known world, and instead encountered a shape that seemed to belong to another category entirely. That is what makes the case endure. Not simply the figure itself, but the emotional reversal at its center. People climbed a hill expecting answers and came back with a deeper uncertainty. The object in the sky may have had one explanation, the being in the clearing may have had another, or both may have been linked only by the mind's urgent need to assemble a coherent story while the body is flooded with fear. Still, one question remains in the silence after every retelling. If the eye can be fooled so completely, why do the memories of that night remain so sharply outlined? And if they were not fooled, what was waiting on that hill when the flashlight found it? What do we really inherit from these encounters once the fear has faded and the witnesses are gone? By now, the pattern is familiar. A place grows quiet. Someone sees a form that does not fit the expected order of things. Others confirm pieces of it, doubt parts of it, reshape it in memory, argue over it in public, and pass it onward until the original moment is surrounded by interpretation like a fossil trapped in layers of stone. Across France, Kentucky, Massachusetts, Iowa, Ohio, and West Virginia, the details shift wildly. Yet beneath those differences, the emotional architecture remains remarkably constant. First comes interruption, then uncertainty, then the long, unfinished work of meaning. What makes these stories endure is not merely that they resist explanation. Many unexplained things disappear from collective memory. These do not. They remain because they gather around something deeply human. The experience of reaching the edge of understanding and realizing the world does not become less real there, only less obedient. That realization can be frightening, but it can also be clarifying. It reminds us that modern life, for all its measurements and maps, still contains regions that are lived before they are understood. And perhaps the creatures themselves, whether misidentified animals, fear-made apparitions, or something stranger, are only part of the inheritance. The larger legacy is what they reveal about us. We are storytelling beings, but not because we are careless with facts. We tell stories because facts alone do not always hold the weight of experience. A red-eyed figure on a roadside, a metallic form on a hill, a pale shape near a stone wall, these become narratives because the heart needs a structure large enough to carry astonishment, dread, and uncertainty together. That is why the language around such events often becomes poetic even when the witnesses are not. The unknown presses on the limits of plain speech. People reach for comparisons, symbols, old names, new metaphors. In doing so, they leave behind more than reports. They leave behind emotional maps of how a mind tries to orient itself when the ordinary world briefly fails. So maybe the question is no longer whether every creature was real in a literal sense. Maybe the better question is, what kind of truth remains when a community insists across years and ridicule and retelling that something happened there that changed the texture of reality? Even skepticism has to reckon with that. Not always with the creature, but with the market left. And once we admit that, the stories open again, not as proof, not as fantasy, but as evidence of a deeply human condition. We are never only looking for monsters. We are looking for the shape of our own uncertainty and for a way to live beside it without turning away. Why do some mysteries become more meaningful the longer they remain unresolved? As years pass, the sharp edges of an encounter often soften, but its outline can grow larger. A witness ages, a town changes, roads are widened, buildings are torn down, younger generations inherit the story without inheriting the original fear. And yet something remains. Not certainty, but residue. A name spoken with a half smile, a stretch of woods locals still mention carefully. A bridge, a field, a farmhouse, a hillside that no longer belongs entirely to the ordinary world. Time does not always erase the unknown. Sometimes it gives it a second life. This is where mystery becomes culture. What began as a single report or a brief cluster of sightings slowly settles into festivals, books, local museums, whispered family memories, roadside markers, late-night radio, and documentary retellings. The unexplained becomes part of a community's identity. That process can seem like dilution, as though the deeper strangeness has been turned into entertainment, but it can also be a form of preservation. Communities, like individuals, create rituals around what once frightened them. Naming it, revisiting it, even celebrating it can be a way of living with what never fully made sense. There is something tender in that transformation. A terrifying event becomes a story told across generations, and in that retelling, the emotional tone changes. Fear gives way to reflection. Isolation gives way to shared memory. People who were once ridiculed become, in hindsight, custodians of a local inheritance. Whether they saw a creature, a misread animal, or a moment shaped by stress and darkness, they offered the town a lasting question. And questions, more than answers, are often what bind communities over time. Perhaps that is why these stories matter beyond their details. They remind us that mystery is not always an enemy of reason. Sometimes it is reason's companion, asking us to stay humble in the face of incomplete knowledge. It asks us to resist the easy comfort of total dismissal just as much as the easy thrill of absolute belief. Between those two extremes lies a rarer discipline, the ability to remain curious without surrendering judgment, and to honor human experience without turning every shadow into revelation. In that space, the old encounters become something quietly valuable. They are no longer just stories about monsters or anomalies. They are stories about how people remember, how places absorb emotion, and how uncertainty can travel through time without losing its power. The unknown survives not because it defeats explanation, but because it keeps asking something essential of us. Can we live with a mystery and still remain honest? Can we admit that not everything meaningful can be settled, measured, or neatly resolved? In the end, that may be the real test these stories offer. Not whether we believe them, but whether we are willing to let wonder and doubt share the same room. What if the real boundary we keep crossing is not between human and monster, but between certainty and humility? By the time a mystery reaches its final retellings, it often says less about the creature at its center than about the age that preserved it. Every era leaves its fingerprints on the unknown. In one century, a beast becomes a sign of wilderness pushing back against fragile civilization. In another, a winged figure near abandoned military ground begins to absorb anxieties about technology, disaster, and the unseen costs of progress. Elsewhere, a pale form on a roadside reflects something quieter, the unease of realizing that even in a mapped suburban world, strangeness still slips through. That is why these stories cannot be reduced only to error or only to revelation. They live in the charged middle ground where perception, culture, and emotion meet. A frightened witness may misinterpret what was seen, yet still tell an emotionally truthful story about vulnerability. A town may exaggerate and embellish, yet still preserve something authentic about the atmosphere of a historical moment. The facts matter. They always matter. But so does the human condition in which those facts are experienced, remembered, and transformed. And perhaps that is where the enduring dignity of these accounts can be found. Not in proving that every shadow concealed a hidden species or a visitor from elsewhere, but in recognizing how seriously ordinary people took the task of describing what unsettled them. They looked, they doubted themselves, they spoke anyway. That act alone deserves more care than ridicule often allows. To report the unexplained is to risk embarrassment in defense of experience. It is a vulnerable, stubbornly human thing to do. We inherit these encounters then, not as verdicts but as invitations. They ask us to think about how knowledge is formed, how memory bends, how fear sharpens the senses even as it distorts them, and how communities build meaning out of events that refuse clean explanation. They remind us that wonder is not childish, and skepticism is not cruelty, unless either one hardens into certainty too quickly. The wiser posture may be the more difficult one, to listen carefully, question honestly, and leave room for what remains unresolved. Because in the end, the unknown may not be a flaw in our understanding. It may be part of what keeps understanding alive. As long as there are stories that resist closure, there will be reasons to look again at the world we thought we knew and to admit that knowledge is not a fortress. It is a lantern, useful, fragile, and brightest at the edge of the dark. And once we accept that, only one final step remains, to ask what these strange inheritances reveal, not about what we fear, but about what it means to remain curious in a world that never fully explains itself. In the end, perhaps the enduring power of these stories lies not in whether every account can be proven, but in the quiet way they return us to ourselves. Across centuries and landscapes, from French villages, shadowed by fear, to American roads lit only by headlights, people have described moments when the world no longer seemed fully legible. A figure appeared where none should have been. A shape moved with a logic that felt unfamiliar. A community paused, looked again, and realized that certainty had limits. Some of those moments were surely mistakes, sharpened by darkness, stress, weather, and the strange generosity of human imagination. Some may have been rare animals, half seen and transformed by context. And some remain unresolved not because they are supernatural, but because experience itself is rarely as tidy as explanation demands. Yet what survives is not just confusion, it is attention. These stories ask us to notice how quickly the ordinary can become mysterious, how deeply place and memory shape what we believe we see, and how much of human life is spent negotiating the distance between fact and meaning. The witnesses in these accounts were not trying to become symbols. Most were simply trying to describe a moment that unsettled them. In their uncertainty, they offered something deeply recognizable, the effort to speak honestly when language feels too small. That may be the most human thread running through all of this. We are creatures who seek understanding, but also creatures who live with incomplete maps. We build sciences, archives, and careful histories, and still there are nights, landscapes, and memories that resist full capture. This is not a failure of reason. It is a reminder of reason's setting, a vast and complicated world in which not every question yields on command. The mature response is not surrender to fantasy, nor reflexive dismissal, but a steadier kind of humility. So the monsters of these stories may matter less as beings than as thresholds. They stand at the border between fear and curiosity, between private experience and public doubt, between what can be measured and what can only be felt. They remind us that mystery is not always something to conquer. Sometimes it is something to sit beside, to learn from, to allow without letting it rule us. And maybe that is the final truth hidden inside every long-forgotten sighting. What looks like a story about the unknown is often a story about memory, grief, wonder, and the fragile courage of paying attention. We look into the dark hoping to find an answer. What we often find instead is a better question. Not what was out there exactly, but what kind of beings we become when faced with what we cannot fully explain.